The Pushkin State Museum of Fine Art is one of the main museums in Russia. Every year it is visited by more than 1 million people, and its collection holds more than 670,000 pieces, among which are paintings, sculptures, drawings, photographs, archaeological findings and more. It took many years to form this collection, and its every piece has a story behind it. This is one of them. April 1909. A month before, a decision was made to acquire a unique collection of a Russian Egyptologist and a collector, Vladimir Golenischev. 224 boxes filled with Egyptian artifacts arrived to Moscow to find their new home in the Fine Arts Museum. Inside of one of those boxes was an ancient burial shroud. This shroud has almost 2,000 years of history. At the time when Egypt was one of the Roman Empire provinces, such shrouds were a part of the burial cult. They were placed over bodies of the dead and perhaps even decorated the tomb walls. At one moment, the shrouds reached such popularity that they became mass-produced. The images of a body and the gods would be painted in advance, and a portrait of a deceased would be glued onto the fabric later. Despite their widespread use, such shrouds as the one from the Pushkin Museum are rare objects in museum collections. There are only 6 shrouds with similar iconography of a deceased accompanied by the gods Anubis and Osiris in the entire world. Out of those 6, this one is the only one where the gods accompany a woman holding a hand of a child. It is unknown where the shroud came from, who its owner was, or who is depicted on it. Golenischev used to find objects for his collection mainly at the markets and the antique shops, where the sellers were rarely aware of the origins of their goods. The state of preservation of ancient artifacts in many ways depends on excavation conditions. Nowadays, having an art conservatory at the site is considered necessary. As an alternative, archaeologists have to have skills of field conservation. Temperature and humidity fluctuations are one of the main reasons of artifact damage during excavation. The 19th century archaeologists not only didn't know how to treat their findings correctly, but quite often disregarded the pieces, thinking them not valuable enough, and it happened to textiles especially often. This negligence was not the only factor which affected the shroud's state. Just like the majority of archaeological artifacts, it went through conservation treatments many times. By the time Golenischev acquired it for his collection, the shroud had undergone several treatments. In the 19th century, it was lined with new fabric with the use of gelatinous glue. Such methods are considered outdated these days. Something that, on one hand, had helped to preserve the piece in a relatively good state, on the other hand, became one of the reasons why its condition worsened over time. For many years, the Pushkin Museum specialists had monitored its condition. Eventually, as a result of natural aging, the glue used by the 19th century conservators dried out. It caused many breakages and deformations of the canvas, led to blistering and peeling of the paint layer. Besides that, at some areas glue soaked through the linen canvas, staining the image. When new conservation treatments became a necessity, preparations began. And this is where our story starts. Any museum piece in need of conservation has to go through the Conservation Council first. Art conservators, researchers and curators decide what tests have to be done and discuss methods of conservation. The project on conserving the shroud had promised to be difficult. The preparations alone took half a year. The conservators' main goal was to suspend the shroud's deterioration and to document all the stages of the process. A special studio was set up for this purpose, containing a table big enough to fit the shroud and equipped with Panasonic cameras to document the process of conservation. One of the cameras was placed directly above the table. Another one is mobile and was used to take close-up shots of the shroud. Thanks to that, the museum holds terabytes of video footage of the process in its possession. Every conservation treatment should start with research. This time, many questions had to be answered. What materials had been used to make the shroud? What was its state of preservation? And what consequences resulted from previous attempts at conserving the piece? There were other questions regarding the history. What its unique iconography meant? Who was depicted on the shroud? Why a woman and a child? Scientists and researchers, art historians and conservators teamed up to find the answers. First, the shroud was photographed. These are images taken in soft light and with side lighting. The photograph's high resolution allows to zoom in and see the smallest details of the surface. Side light photography helps to evaluate its condition. Radiography was done next to determine the materials the shroud was made of, as well as to clarify the areas with paint loss. It also confirmed the theory about the history of the piece. The X-rays clearly showed that the image of a child was painted significantly later than the woman's. Albeit indirectly, it also confirmed the theory of anthropologists who suggested that the young woman and her son fell victims to an epidemic. The boy followed his mother, after which his image was added to the shroud. In the 2nd century BC, the plague of Galen spread across the Roman provinces. Could it affect Egypt as well? Quite possibly, but it is unlikely that we will ever get a confirmation of whether it really happened. The IR photography is used to show the details that can't be perceived with the naked eye. And this is a UV photograph. Numerous paint loss areas and other damages are clearly visible in it, as opposed to a regular photograph. We can also notice areas affected by previous conservation treatments. In these photographs, different pigments of the same color have different luminescence depending on their chemical makeup. Macrophotography was conducted using last-generation electronic microscopes. It allowed to evaluate the state of the linen fibers and see how exactly the 19th century conservators attached it to the new lining. Evidently, they used gelatinous glue or glue made of animal bones and ligaments. Technical and technological research was conducted to study the pigments and adhesives used to make the shroud. It became clear that the pigments were typical for the time: gypsum, ori pigment, ochre, and indigo. Finding gypsum in the paint layer was an unpleasant surprise for art conservators, as it provided certain challenges for the conservation process. All the different shades and colors visible on the surface were made with just these 4 pigments mixed with gelatinous glue. The research clarified which areas were altered in the 19th century. Fragments of fabric on Osiris's headpiece were possibly taken from another shroud. Ink paintings were found on the same headpiece as well as Anubis's clothing. Zinc oxide was found in ink paintings and other added materials. Zinc oxide is a pigment that became widespread in the middle of the 19th century. One of the most important examinations was a microbiological one. It was conducted in the Moscow State University Department of Biology's laboratory. Paintings normally contain a wide spectrum of organic matters. They can become a breeding ground for microorganisms that are capable of destroying the paint layer, thus permanently damaging the piece. Microbiological studies can determine the presence of bacteria or fungi even when it's not apparent, preventing possible damage. The laboratory results showed that the contamination level of the air around the shroud was within low limits. It meant that there weren't any active microbial growth in its components. Perhaps it had taken place in the past and the conservators only had to deal with the aftermath. An antiseptic was added to the strengthening solution as a preventative measure. All the tests helped a group of conservators headed by Natalia Sinitsina to fully evaluate the shroud's state of preservation. Their new objective was to develop the best possible program of conservation treatments. The first challenge was to remove the 19th century lining from original canvas without disturbing the paint layer. Large amounts of gypsum were found in the paint layer, so it was dangerous to use any water-based solutions because it could result in paint layer damage, as gypsum is a water-soluble material. Another challenging feature was the lack of so-called gesso, or a primer, underneath the paint layer. With time, it led to a lack of cohesion between the paints and the canvas. Every time the shroud was moved, particles of paints would separate from the surface. This factor excluded turning the shroud upside down. For several months, the conservators had been separating the canvas from the lining, centimeter by centimeter, brilliantly overcoming the challenge. After the lining removal, the shroud was moved onto a flat surface. The next step was mending the deformations. The choice of strengthening solution was not easy. After consulting with chemists, the conservators settled on fluorine-containing solution. After the paint layer was consolidated and the deformations mended, it was time to reline the shroud. For that purpose, conservators chose Indian cotton, dense yet translucent. The fabric was dyed neutral beige and stretched. After that, remaining fragments of the shroud were placed onto it. Small amounts of Lasco glue were used to fix the edges of the fragments onto the fabric. The glue was applied to the lining with a thin needle. Restoring nearly lost image of the young woman's face proved to be delicate and difficult work. Initially, the portrait was painted on a separate piece of fabric and fixed upon the shroud with large amounts of glue. The glue soaked through the fabric and damaged threads. The original painting was damaged beyond repair. The 19th century conservators inserted blank pieces of canvas in places of loss. All the remaining pieces of the original canvas were carefully cleaned, put together and lined. In this case, lining was made with the translucent silk. At the same time, museum artists were searching for similar portraits from the era. As a result, several Fayum portraits were used as reference. The artists managed to make several reconstructions of the young woman's face. All the images were printed on fabric with a different color intensity. The one that was chosen was the least saturated. It was placed under the thin silk lining with original fragments on it. To show what the piece looked like at the moment it was made, it was decided to make a full image reconstruction. After careful studies, the image was completed by an artist who painted the missing parts on a printed photograph of the shroud. After that, the image was finished digitally. What you see here is a result of the artist's work, an imagined reconstruction of the shroud. When the long work of the conservatories came to an end, the only thing that was left was to find a way to exhibit the shroud and have it protected at the same time. A special protective case was built for that. It consists of a frame in which the shroud is placed. It is covered by a special plexiglass. The construction is hermetic and protects the shroud from exposure to humidity and temperature changes. The frame of the shroud is angled. Placing the piece at an angle as opposed to vertical position allows avoiding using mountings, which essentially benefits the piece's condition. Thanks to the conservators' hard work, the shroud's 2,000 years long journey will not end here. It has a long life within the walls of the museum ahead, and the conservators will continue to monitor its condition.